Okay, good morning to everybody. My name is Lynette Ong. I'm a professor of political science and director of the China Governance Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto. Let's start with land acknowledgement. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So let me introduce the speakers today. Um, Professor Taylor Jost, who is an assistant professor of political science at Brown University. His research focuses on national security decision making, major power politics, and Chinese foreign policy. Um, he is the author of Bureaucracies at War, which is the subject matter of the webinar this morning. His research has been published in International Organization, International Security, Journal of Conflict Resolution, International Studies Quarterly, as well as the China Quarterly. He is currently working on his second book, examining major power cooperation in the modern era, focusing on the evolution of U.S. government relations since 1989. He completed his PhD from the Department of Government at Harvard University and has held postdoctoral fellowships at John F. Kennedy School of Government as well as Columbia University. So Bureaucracies at War is a book that has intrigued me about how bureaucracies are absolutely crucial to the outcome of conflicts. And I thought, it's an important subject matter to examine in this age of uncertainty, right? With very tense U.S.-China relations, but also Canada-China relations. And I've been trying to find a discussant to discuss his talk today, unsuccessfully though. So I will also double up as a discussant, hopefully with some interesting things to say. So over to you, Tyler.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Ong, for hosting me today. It's really a pleasure to be with you. Let me pull up these slides so that everyone can see them. Um, Great. So the point of departure for this book is the fact that international conflicts often turn out much differently than decision makers think that they will, something that Professor Ong just alluded to. Um, in the Apologies, I'm just trying to. Great. In the early months of 1979, for example, China's national leaders approved a short but powerful invasion of Vietnam. And the logic of that invasion, that foreign policy choice, was quite simple. China would teach its southern neighbor a lesson through a short invasion that would demonstrate China's military prowess, akin to the way that China had demonstrated its military prowess against India in that short war in the fall of 1962. But the war in 1979 ended up having the exact opposite effect that decision makers in Beijing wanted when it came to Vietnam. Poor performance on the battlefield demonstrated China's military weaknesses rather than its strengths. And as Vietnamese leaders would note internally shortly after the war, it was, quote, not China who taught Vietnam a lesson, but Vietnam who taught China a lesson. This somewhat stylized distillation of the 1979 war illustrates an important and arguably quite tragic point about the nature of war itself. Decision makers so frequently charge headfirst into conflicts that ultimately fail to deliver the benefits that they anticipate. And this mismatch between expectation and outcome often leads decision makers to question, with the benefit of hindsight, whether they might have made different decisions if a different set of information had been available to them at the time. In the context of the US escalation in Vietnam, for example, Numerous senior U.S. officials would later reflect on just how inaccurate their views at the time were. Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, in his memoirs, famously claimed that U.S. decision makers were, quote, wrong, terribly wrong. Similarly, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, in an unpublished manuscript available in the JFK archives here in Boston, Massachusetts, put the point more precisely that the spread of communism in Asia, Bundy claimed, quote, could have been contained just about as well as it was at much lower cost, end quote. So this leads to the central question of the book: why states miscalculate on the road to war? And as political scientists or historians, we might be immediately drawn to the answer that while hindsight might be 2020, a decision maker's view at the time is often quite blurry. And as a result, we might be tempted to conclude that given the pervasive nature of uncertainty in international conflict, what some refer to as the fog of war, sometimes things are going to go differently differently than what you expect, no matter what you do. But this book reaches a somewhat different conclusion. Some level of unanticipated failure, I argue, is certainly unavoidable, but over time, states do better or worse depending on how they choose to design institutions for foreign policy decision-making. And some institutions perform better than others at delivering more complete and accurate information, and that in turn shapes the pattern of conflict outcomes that we observe in the world. My argument centers on a particular set of formal and informal institutions that I argue shape the propensity for miscalculation, those regulating the relationship between political leaders, think presidents or prime ministers or even dictators on the one hand, and their diplomatic, defense, and intelligence bureaucracies on the other. And of course, this book is certainly not the first to discuss the role of bureaucracy in decision-making. There's a long tradition dating back to Graham Allison's work in the 1970s that has probed the topic. But I would contend that if there's a single conventional wisdom that underpins this body of work, it is that integrating bureaucracy into decision-making tends to muck things up. It degrades process and delivers biased information that can lead policymakers astray. Or, as the colloquial saying goes, a camel is a horse designed by a committee. My argument here is that we have this quite wrong. Bureaucratic participation in decision-making, I argue, is actually quite helpful in avoiding miscalculation, particularly when institutions channeling this participation are properly designed. First, bureaucracy provides leaders with access to more information than any human being has access to on their own or could collect on their own. And second, and just as importantly, putting bureaucracies with competing interests and perspectives in dialogue with one another. Specifically in the book, I focus on defense bureaucracies and diplomatic bureaucracies, forces debate and deliberation that improves the quality of information upon which leaders can base their decision. This leads to the title of the book, which is Putting Bureaucracies at War at Home Prevents Miscalculation on the Road to War Abroad. And to be clear, this isn't the only reason that states miscalculate, but I show that this logic of institutional miscalculation, focusing on these institutions that connect political leaders with their bureaucrats, is far more common than the literature has previously acknowledged. Of course, this naturally raises a question, if not a puzzle, of why leaders would ever adopt anything but the institutions that I'm describing to you that would be efficient for decision-making. And the second half of the book offers an answer to this puzzle of inefficient design rooted in political survival. And my argument here is that leaders face a trade-off in terms of optimal institutions. Institutions that deliver high-quality information allow bureaucrats to gain access to information, to build expertise, and to garner authority, all of which bureaucrats can use to punish the leader. That is, institutions that are effective from the perspective of decision-making can also be a liability for a political leader. Leaders resolve this trade-off in large part based upon their domestic political environment. When leaders see bureaucrats as the bureaucratic state as a threat to their power, institutions that become inefficient from the standpoint of decision-making become efficient from the perspective of politics. And putting these two components together, the book suggests that miscalculations on the road to war are often the result of these domestic political incentives that drive leaders into adopting institutions that are politically expedient, but nonetheless deprive them of quality information. So the book has more in it than I'm able to cover in a single talk. And so in the remainder of the session today, I want to focus on three parts of the book. First, I want to lay out the theoretical argument in a little bit more detail than I just have. Second, I want to give an overview of the case evidence holistically. And finally, I want to use the example of how evolution of decision-making institutions in China under Mao Zedong illustrates the book's argument about miscalculation. So let's start with the theory. The book begins with a kind of stylized idea or setup with a leader looking out at the world and contemplating whether or not they should initiate an international confrontation with another country. The leader could see this confrontation as a pathway to help them advance their national interest, but all else equal, they would prefer to avoid the costs of conflict if those conflicts don't ultimately advance those interests. Essentially, they have a type of prediction problem about the probable costs and benefits of confrontation they're contemplating, along with the probability of achieving what it is that they want to achieve. Miscalculation occurs in the book when leaders choose a strategy based upon an inaccurate assessment of one of these basic parameters. Now, in performing this task, leaders could make the decisions entirely in isolation by themselves in the Oval Office or in the depths of Zhongnanhai. But leaders have another option. They can lead on subordinates in the state, that is, their bureaucracy. Now, this choice about how leaders choose to structure the relationship with the bureaucracy becomes the analytical center point piece of the book, a typology of four institutional arrangements. And in this part of the argument, what I'm trying to accomplish is to provide us, those of us who study international politics, with a framework and a lexicon to think systematically about the differences that exist in bureaucratic structures across time and space. We already have the ability to speak systematically about these differences in institutions that regulate the relationship between state and society. Namely, we in common parlance talk about the distinction between democracy and autocracy, and within the literature on autocracies, various types of them. Same with democracies. What we want here is the ability to speak in similarly precise and systematic ways about the institutions that regulate the relationship between leaders and the bureaucratic state. Now, this typology posits that there are two dimensions of this relationship that can structure our thinking. The first dimension pertains to the capacity to assist leaders in searching for information within the state, and the second dimension pertains to the capacity to share information across different bureaucratic organizations. In Cartesian terms, if this is helpful, you could think about this as institutions in the first dimension enabling vertical information flow, and in the second dimension enabling horizontal information flow. And we can think about each dimension as a continuum from high to low values. In the first dimension, institutions can be quite inclusive, easing the cost of information flow from bureaucrats to the leader and vice versa, or they can be quite insular, raising those same costs. The same is true for the second dimension. Institutions can be open, allowing information to flow relatively freely across organizational boundaries, or they can be intentionally closed, imposing added obstacles to horizontal sharing across bureaucratic organizations. These two dimensions yield four institutional types, and again, we can think about these as the bureaucratic analogs to describing a state as a democracy or autocracy at a particular moment in time. So in the next few slides, we want to move from this typology to begin to connect this with predictions about what we might expect in terms of miscalculation propensity. Now, the core claim here is that integrated institutions reduce the likelihood of miscalculation by supplying leaders with more complete and accurate information as they choose between peace and conflict. And the intuition behind integrated institutions is that there are transaction costs associated with searching for information within the state. Just because bureaucrats have a certain bit of information does not necessarily mean that it will make its way up to the leader as they're making consequential foreign policy choices, even when the leader has the power and authority over the bureaucrat. Leaders need tools to reach into the state and pull out and extract the information that they need. So in this book, I argue that leaders can set formal and informal rules that lower these information search costs. And this is precisely what's at the heart of an integrated institution. One helpful way of illustrating this is by thinking about the design of a leader's advisory body, such as a National Security Council. Now, we might be tempted to think that a National Security Council is a quite odd feature of the United States. But these types of bodies are actually quite pervasive internationally. For example, you see here a meeting of the National Security Council in Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek's son, Jiang Jingguo. And the existence of these bodies, the appointments of the bureaucratic representatives on them, as well as commitments to use these bodies, all establish formal and informal norms that lower information search costs. Now, the second part of the logic of integrated institutions, however, is that leaders want to design these institutions or arrange these bodies in ways that naturally and almost automatically facilitate deliberation. After all, one core wisdom of the traditional bureaucratic politics literature is that bureaucrats tend to be parochially biased. They see the world through their lens, and that might, an integrated institution from that perspective, solely the access to information, could actually lead leaders astray because that biased information is making its way up. And so I argue that integration of two key bureaucratic constituencies helps to overcome these biases. And those are diplomatic and defense ministries. Now, the logic of the dialogue between these two bureaucratic actors is twofold. First, diplomatic and defense ministries focus on different but equally important parts of a leader's choices on the road to war. Diplomatic ministries have information about the other side's political will and resolve, which could shape a leader's estimates of the adversary's willingness to pay costs on the battlefield rather than make concessions. Defense ministries, on the other hand, have unique information about the other side's material capabilities and the likelihood that leaders would be able to win on the battlefield. But there's a second component about this diplomatic defense dialogue that makes it important, and that is that diplomatic and defense ministries tend to attract and perhaps even socialize people to thinking about the world in different ways. In other work, I show that defense ministries tend to be filled with individuals displaying more hawkish worldviews. That is, they tend to emphasize the efficacy and appropriateness of using violence to solve international disputes. But in contrast, diplomatic ministries tend to exhibit less hawkish worldviews, emphasizing the efficacy and appropriateness of diplomatic engagement. The logic of integrated institutions in this respect is that the competitive dialogue between these two constituencies allows each side to not only complement each other's information, but also to naturally set up deliberative interactions in which each side is naturally, and again, almost automatically situated to poke holes in the other side's arguments. Members of Eisenhower's National Security Council referred to this as an acid bath that information had to pass through before it was presented to the president. And there's a strategic logic here as well that would be familiar to us, those of us in academia. Both sides know that the other side will pick apart their claims. So in that world, you might be less likely to advocate things that you know are clearly wrong because you know that peers will poke holes in your logic. So let's move on to the other type of institutions, but at a slightly faster clip. Now, the book claims, the claim the book makes regarding siloed and fragmented institutions is that they raise the risk of miscalculation relative to integrated institutions by supplying leaders with less complete and less accurate information as those leaders decide between peace and conflict. In a siloed institution, what makes it easy for bureaucrats, while it is easy for bureaucrats to pass information up the chain of command, so to speak, there are systematic barriers to the bureaucratic's own access to information in other organizational silos. And this has two deleterious effects. The first is that it raises the chance, or it lowers the ability of bureaucrats to poke holes in the other side's information because they simply don't have access to it. So a lack of direct dialogue and debate means that leaders are left with only their personal judgment to determine which or whether bureaucrats are leading them astray. Second, building on that strategic dimension I just referenced in the context of integrated institutions, because bureaucrats know that no one is going to poke holes in their own information, they might be tempted to intentionally bend the truth in ways that suit their parochial interests. And a helpful illustration of this logic comes from the 1999 Kargil War. For those of you who might not be familiar, in the early months of 1999, Pakistan quietly moved troops across the line of control between Indian and Pakistani parts of disputed territory along the border between the two countries. This action triggered military retaliation by India and started the only war that has ever been fought between nuclear powers. What's so puzzling about the Kashmir War is that the initiator, Pakistan in this case, got very little in exchange for the tremendous risks of fighting a war with a nuclear rival. The war failed to change the territory that Pakistan controlled after the fighting was over. Pakistan lost somewhere between 200 and 700 soldiers during the fighting. The war pushed India into a closer relationship with the United States, and responsibility for the war's outcome became the centerpiece for Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's political removal later that year. Now, the book argues that, contrary to the conventional wisdom, the Kargil War was not the result of autonomous military actions. Sharif, the book shows, was briefed on the operation at multiple points in the winter and spring of 1999. Instead, Sharif's problem was twofold, both of which centered around the silo design of Pakistan's institutions at the time. First, Sharif was desperately dependent upon advisors to understand the intricacies of the situation he faced in Kashmir. As one of Sharif's advisors told me during field work that I did in Pakistan, a leader's, quote, mind is made by his advisors, end quote. Second, and equally important, Sharif's advisory system, highly siloed, as I just said, meant that the bureaucratic structure afforded both the foreign and defense ministries access to the leader, but there were few mechanisms to force information sharing between them. And as a result, while there were dissidents within the foreign ministry that would have been skeptical of such military gambits, limits on the foreign minister and foreign secretary's knowledge of what the military was doing meant that they didn't know how much Sharif needed their dissenting analysis, and as such, the analysis did not reach Sharif until it was too late. So finally, the book argues that fragmented institutions also raise the risk of miscalculation, again by supplying incomplete and inaccurate information, but according to a somewhat different logic. So again, going back to the typology, in a fragmented institution, leaders put up systematic barriers to bureaucratic participation in decision-making, and this could be through shutting down advisory bodies, making those bodies more insular, or refusing to appoint defense or diplomatic ministers. Put differently, in the extreme, we are back to the kind of stylized world in which we started, a leader making foreign policy decisions entirely on their own. And if the book's intuition is correct, this should raise the risk of miscalculation for two reasons that sort of parallel what we were talking about in the context of integrated institutions. First, this fragmented design means that leaders only have access to the information they can collect personally. And assuming human limits on information collection, this means that there should be less information available to the leader at the time, and perhaps gaps in what they need to know as they are making consequential choices. Second, there are some reasons to think that this fragmented design will make things even worse than when a leader is deciding on their own, because bureaucrats who remain behind, and infrequently though it may be, do sometimes get access to the leader, will channel information that is biased in ways that confirm the leader's prior belief. In other words, the institutional design itself makes it politically risky to supply information that bureaucrats think will disconfirm the leader's prior beliefs. In other words, what we have in the fragmented system is incentives to become a sycophant. Now, we might think about this type of arrangement as being a peculiarity of personalist dictatorships. But the book shows that this type of institutional arrangement can actually emerge in many country contexts, including institutionalized democracies. Specifically, the chapter on the United States makes the case that a series of changes to the National Security Council under Lyndon Johnson made the U.S. system remarkably fragmented, particularly in comparison to the administrations that had preceded it under Kennedy and Eisenhower and Kennedy. Now, this institutional choice, specifically Johnson's decision to set up what what was called the Tuesday Luncheon, had a real impact on bureaucratic access to the president on the eve of his most fateful foreign policy choice, the escalation in Vietnam. Now, to illustrate this systematically, what I did in the book was collect records of the presidential daily diary, what logs all of a president's meeting, including who participated and how long they spent together. And here you see box plots of these data, grouping meeting participants by their organizational affiliation. And critically, what it shows is how the level of access enjoyed by key constituencies, particularly the military and intelligence advisors that Johnson had, declined remarkably during this period of 1963 to 1967 in comparison to Eisenhower and Kennedy. And that institutional change also had a chilling effect on the choices of advisors themselves. Here you see an excerpt of the memoir of Chester Cooper, the NSC staffer responsible for Vietnam during the escalation. Now, it's really rare for policymakers to discuss past events in a memoir in counterfactual terms, but it is all the more striking when they do so, as Cooper does here. Specifically, Cooper recounts one of the few interactions that he had with the president. And during this meeting, as Johnson was going around the room collecting the thoughts of the NSC, Cooper describes that he had this fantasy about speaking his mind and voicing his opposition to the Vietnam escalation. But because Cooper knew that the president had already made his mind up in the Tuesday luncheon, in other words, in the book's nomenclature, because he knew that the system was fragmented, he found himself expressing agreement with escalation when Johnson finally called upon him. So now I want to take the book's intuition to some of the book's case evidence. Now, this isn't the only methodology that I employ in the project or my broader agenda. For example, the book uses cross-national data on bureaucratic institutions around the globe since the mid-20th century to try to show patterns, how institutional design correlates with patterns of institution or crisis performance. And the book also, as we've sort of illustrated through some of the examples that I referenced during the theory discussion, it has cases on 4 case countries: India, Pakistan, China, and the United States. But what I'm going to focus on in the remaining time is the case of decision-making institutions in China under Mao Zedong. Specifically in the lead up to 2 crises, one in 1962 and one in 1967. The first in which Mao's institutions are relatively integrated, and the second in which his were fragmented after the Cultural Revolution began. Now to preview, there are 3 things that I want to try to show in these cases. The first is that there was a dramatic shift that Mao perceived from the foreign policy bureaucracy, the threat posed by the foreign policy bureaucracy beginning in the early 1960s. The second is that threat led Mao to shift from an integrated design to a fragmented one. And finally, that shift helps to explain some of the miscalculations that occurred during the fragmented period. And in order to do this, I'm interested in drawing a few types of inferences. The first is about the nature of the political environment, whether the leader saw the bureaucracy as a threat to their political agenda and power. The second is about the formal and informal properties of the institution. And on the formal side, I'm interested in organizational records that give us insight into how the diplomatic and defense bureaucracies either were or were not integrated into bodies for decision-making and coordination. And on the informal side, I'm interested in how the leader, in this case Mao Zedong, actually utilized these bodies, structuring opportunities for bureaucrats to share information with the leader and one another. And then lastly, I'm interested in drawing inferences about how these institutional choices shape the leader's decision-making. And here we want to be especially cautious because just because a leader chose a strategy that did not work or made a projection that was not did not ultimately prove to be accurate does not necessarily mean that the institutional design was to blame. So the empirical standard for an institutional miscalculation requires observing 3 things. The first, that the leader's view of the situation was inaccurate. The second, the information to the contrary was available within the system at the time. And 3, that the reason the information failed to reach the leader stemmed from the high transaction costs or strategic incentives to misrepresent that the institutional system would have provided. In other words, what we want is evidence like Chester Cooper's memoirs suggesting that bureaucrats tried and failed to get information to the leader, or that their admission that they deliberately chose to withhold information because they feared political punishment. So let's start with Mao's political environment early on after the PRC is founded. As everyone in this group likely knows, Mao enjoys absolute political power in 1949. Based upon firsthand accounts, the Yan'an Rectification Campaign, coupled with his relatively charismatic leadership within the party, it really makes it nearly unthinkable to think that Mao could be challenged politically during this period. This leaves Mao with a generally low level of threat from the foreign policy bureaucracy specifically through the first decade of his rule. As late as the summer of 1962, in fact, Mao notes internally that he was generally pleased with both the Foreign Ministry and People's Liberation Army, significantly here in the sense that this is happening even after the Great Leap Forward is launched. Mao's domestic political environment was associated with a comparatively integrated design. On the formal level, the organizational membership of key bodies, such as the Politburo and Central Military Commission, which were both included representatives from both the foreign and defense ministries from the PRC's early years, which you see here. Another indication is a series of secretariat and leading small groups, which were established to facilitate horizontal information flow, again, with similarly diverse bureaucratic membership. Informally, records released by the party show that there was actually relatively routine bureaucratic access to Mao, even after the Great Leap Forward begins in 1958. We now know that these included dozens of reports of international and defense affairs, an outline of the Central Military Commission once as Mao was contemplating international crisis. So, as a bit of a recap for those of you who might not be familiar with what happened in the early months of 1962, Chiang Kai-shek begins planning a major military operation targeting the mainland. In his diary, Chiang notes that there was, quote, clear proof that support for the communist regime on the mainland was waning. And he also writes in 1962 that this was his, quote, only favorable opportunity, end quote, for an offensive to take back control of the country. Chiang, as a result, establishes a series of his own bodies, such as the National Recovery Operations Office and the Battlefield Administration Bureau, and begins holding meetings with his defense advisors in the military inner circle to plan this mainland operation. Mao receives early warnings of these developments through military intelligence channels, and he immediately tasks the bureaucracy to draw up plans and assessments. There's debate within the Politburo, the Central Military Commission, as well as the Strategic Research Small Group. Both Foreign Ministry and Defense advisors participated in those deliberations. And essentially, the outcome of those deliberations advised a two-pronged strategy. First, there would be a PLA mobilization to deter a nationalist invasion. And second, the PRC would diplomatically engage the United States to tease out its intentions. Now, information from the Foreign Ministry was critical to Mao's decision-making in a few ways. First, individuals embedded in the foreign affairs bureaucracy noted that an invasion was unlikely if the United States did not approve it. The logic here was quite sound. Taiwan had signed a mutual defense treaty with the United States a few years prior that gave Washington veto authority over a military operation on the scale that Chiang was proposing. Kennedy, of course, was unlikely to have an appetite for such an operation in the wake of the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion. And as such, as Foreign Minister Cheney noted, it was more likely that, quote, Chiang Kai-shek has ignored U.S. restraints, end quote, and that Kennedy would not dare take the risk. As a result, the Foreign Ministry encourages diplomatic engagement with the United States to gauge U.S. willingness to support a KMT attack. The PRC Foreign Ministry representative in Warsaw, Wang Mingnan, meets with side of the slide, now you see what is essentially the CC line of that cable, confirming that the information was relayed to Mao, as well as a number of individuals within the other sectors of the foreign affairs bureaucracy, the intelligence bureaucracy, the military bureaucracy, and so on. And in fact, according to Wang's memoirs, this interaction had, quote, a major effect on decision making at the time. Overall, Mao's choices during the crisis are based upon, I think this illustrates, the information supplied to him by a bureaucratic process that was afforded to him by a relatively stable domestic political environment. Now let's compare this to the period beginning the year after the 1962 mainland invasion scare. Around this time, Mao begins to contemplate his death and what will happen to the party at that critical juncture. As Mao put the problem succinctly, quote, "What will happen after I die?" Now, these conclusions regarding the conclusions that Mao drew contemplating his own mortality were informed by the domestic political events over the past few years at that point. Namely, Mao takes the events of the Great Leap Forward as a premonition that the party would become less revolutionary after he was no longer with them. And as a result, beginning in the fall of 1962 and with elevated clip as the party approaches the launch of the Cultural Revolution, Mao increasingly sees the bureaucracy as a direct threat to his legacy and the Chinese Revolution writ large. We see this in Mao's frequent discussions of revisionism within the party. In May 1963, for example, Mao expresses concern that China will change its revolutionary color. In October 1963, he notes, quote, that measures must be taken, end quote, to curb the risk of such internal changes. And moreover, what is unique about Mao's domestic threat perceptions in the 1960s is that he sees an international dimension to the fading revolutionary color of the regime, likely colored in own part by the ideological competition between China and the Soviet Union at the time. Somewhat tragically, this puts the foreign affairs bureaucracy squarely in Mao's sights in ways that they had not been in the past. As early as the fall of 1962, Mao commented in internal memoranda to the foreign ministry that diplomats need to pay attention to, quote, the connection between revisionism at home and abroad, end quote. And during the Three Winds campaign that fall, Mao targets this Chinese diplomat, Wang Jiaxiang, one of the first of the foreign affairs bureaucracy to be caught up in the politics of Mao's succession. Of course, this is an understatement to say that these early insights into Mao's fears were nothing in comparison of that exhibited during the Cultural Revolution itself. Mao's changing perceptions of bureaucratic threat dramatically reshaped China's institutional design, moving it towards a more fragmented structure. Mao shifts his decision-making from the more inclusive Politburo to the more exclusive Standing Committee, in which there is no diplomatic representation. This institutional choice had an important effect on access to the leader. In the figure we see here, essentially a quantification of those party records that I showed to you earlier in the presentation, kind of similar to what the Presidential Daily Diary does for the United States. Those records provide daily records of meetings that the leader has. And here we have a quantification over time of how frequent members of different bureaucratic organizations had access to Mao Zedong. And so in this figure on the right-hand side, we see a major drop in the access of China's diplomats in the 3-year period between the Great Leap Forward and the launch of the Cultural Revolution. And this drop reaches an almost non-existent level of contact during the tumult of the early Cultural Revolution, that is the period between 1966 and 1969. Now, that winnowing of connective tissue between Mao and his foreign affairs team is institutionalized through a series of choices he makes in the 1960s. He establishes a cultural revolutionary group that replaces the Politburo in the late 1960s. He removes senior leadership from the foreign ministry, including the minister itself, Chen Yi, without assigning a replacement. And he dramatically curtails China's bureaucratic capacity writ large. Party organizational records that are now available suggest that roughly 70% of the foreign ministry personnel stationed in Beijing were sent down to the countryside to learn from the peasantry. And all but one of China's ambassadors were recalled to Beijing to participate in the Cultural Revolution. Mao's choices had a really chilling effect on the foreign policy bureaucracy and the behavior within it more broadly. One CCP historian, Zhang Baizhan, notes, for example, that after the 1962 removal of Wang Jiaxiang, Mao's subordinates, quote, did not dare suggest changes in Chinese foreign policy, end quote. Other firsthand accounts describe that the bureaucracy of this time period is filled with sycophants aiming to please higher ups rather than speak truth to power. Now, the Sino-Soviet border conflict in 1969 offers a helpful illustration of how these institutional changes explain some of China's miscalculations during this period. As a bit of background, on March 2nd, 1969, Chinese forces stationed in Zhenbao Island along China's northeastern border with the Soviet Union launched an ambush on Soviet forces. Now, Mao's choice to launch the ambush was based upon essentially three assessments. First, Mao believed that the Soviet Union would not escalate. On the contrary, Mao intimated internally that the attack would be viewed defensively by Moscow. As Mao put it, and this is a direct quote, the Soviets know that we will not invade their country as it is so cold there, end quote.
Can you
Second,
uh
Mao,
can you wrap up soon? I would like to have some time for Q&A.
sure, yeah, I will be about 5 more minutes if that's all right.
Okay, we'll have less time for Q&A then. It's your decision. But
Yeah,
I would like to, have some time
absolutely.
for discussion.
Okay. So second, Mao believed that the Soviet Union was contemplating a preemptive attack on China. Orders from Beijing in 1967, for example, noted that the Soviet leadership had, quote, inherited czarist ambitions of securing a sphere of influence along China's border. And third, Mao concluded that there were few alternative policy options available. In particular, Mao did not believe at the time was yet ripe for a rapprochement with the United States that China might use to deter a Soviet attack. That there is considerable evidence now available, including from archival records declassified by the Soviet Union and the United States, suggesting that all three assessments were inaccurate. First, the Soviet Union quickly escalated the conflict as a result of the ambush, counterattacking on the northeastern front later that month and opening up another front in Xinjiang in August, issuing veiled nuclear threats in that fall that led Mao to actually evacuate the capital. Second, there is actually little evidence from Soviet records, including Brezhnev's own diary, that the Soviet Union was contemplating a preemptive attack on Beijing before the ambush. In fact, it was only after Mao approves the attack that the leadership in Moscow began to seriously consider military action towards China. In other words, Mao in this way kind of causes the outcome that he had hoped to prevent. And third, the book argues that Mao misread the United States. Nixon, as early as January and February of 1969, was keenly interested in rapprochement with China. That is, Nixon was open to rapprochement even before Mao orders the ambush of Soviet troops. And we might be tempted to think about these miscalculations as inevitable. After all, uncertainty pervades international politics, so maybe Mao did the best that he could with the information that he had at the time. But there is considerable evidence to suggest that this story is not so simple. Information was available within the Chinese bureaucracy that contradicted each of Mao's judgments, and that information failed to reach Mao. For example, Chinese diplomats appear to have assessed that the international situation did not favor a Soviet invasion of China, but bureaucrats resisted supplying that information to Mao. As noted by several senior bureaucrats in the spring of 1969, it would be, quote, easier said than done to propose a different way of thinking, even when Mao was requesting analysis to inform his policymaking. Another helpful illustration of the functional impediments to information flow inside the Chinese state at this time comes from this man, Wang Guoquan, who replaced Wang Bingnan as the Chinese ambassador in Poland. Wang later noted that he had noticed a change in U.S. policy at the time, but that change in the U.S.'s stance, willingness, hinting that it was willing to have a more reevaluate its relationship to the PRC, failed to make its way to decision-making circles precisely because of the domestic tumult of this period. Now, to reiterate, these cases, like the ones I have just presented, offer somewhat vivid illustrations of the theory's logic, but they're not the only way to study it. The book also evaluates the institutional performance across all international crises to which China was party, and it applies the same procedure across other case countries as well. And more generally, the book is part of a research agenda that's trying to show that bureaucracy is not only important, but perhaps, contrary to what the existing literature has told us, is not necessarily as deleterious to decision-making as we might think. It's not necessarily the case that a camel is a horse designed by a committee, to use the opening kind of the language of the introduction. Rather, integrating bureaucrats into decision-making processes, particularly under the right institutional context and arrangements, can have an improving effect on the ability of states to avoid miscalculation on the road to war. So thanks so much for the time to present this today. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A.
Very good. So let me start with a question about your research setup or your research design. So you were looking at kind of conflicts outcome and then institutions and then political elites. Um, so so do you see kind of institutions having its own agencies, or are they a product or a creation of political elite? So here I'm thinking about, Pepinski's argument about institutional turn. He was critiquing authoritarian politics literature about institutional turn in the literature that institutions are ultimately endogenous to the model, and they are a product of elite consensus or lack of consensus, state society dynamics, or even social conflicts.
Yeah.
But it sounds to me that you are actually putting a lot more emphasis on institutions than the other people would suggest. Am I
No,
right?
it's the second of the way that you described it. So institutions in the model are the result of how leaders reconcile that trade-off between efficient decision making and protecting themselves politically. And how they resolve the trade-off is a kind of function of their domestic political environment. Once those institutional choices are made, however, it's not so much that they have agency, because this is written, institutions here are kind of in the definition is kind of in the North and Weingast tradition, formal and informal rules. But once those informal and informal rules are set, the established patterns of behavior that bureaucrats within that structure exhibit are different. So they have agency in the sense that they get to make choices, but the choices of the bureaucrats depend upon the institutional structure that the leader has designed.
Okay, and how does your argument as a whole kind of you have used a number of cases across democracies and non-democracies, right? I'm curious. I mean, the arguments must diverge between democracies and non-democracies because in democracies, the leader alone cannot call the shot, right? He has to consult a range of people within the political elites, as well as, the institutional design in itself might be a reflection of societal expectations and not
I,
the leader's prerogative per se, right?
I really like the way that you frame that. I mean, I think it's helpful to think about the design of these institutions as following a kind of general set of political principles, and then the regime type in which they are chosen might in some ways shape the way that leaders think about their design choices and think about the trade-off. One thing that's interesting, though, to pick up on what you open with, though, that in democracies, leaders get to or have to consult with a broader range of individuals before they make the choice. So that's probably true. What I do find is that even in democracies, so it looks at the United States, a presidential system, India, a parliamentary system with a prime minister. Um, the leader still has overwhelming power when it comes to foreign policy crises. And so it's not to say that Congress is not lurking in the background in the context of the United States, or Parliament in the context of India. But when making these choices about exactly how to respond in a crisis, what diplomatic, negotiations are going to be pursued, what military plans are going to be approved for the battlefield, these national leaders, these chief executives, really, even in democratic contexts, enjoy tremendous power and authority, which really make them the focal point for the book.
Okay. I have one more question before opening it up to the floor.
Please.
So I've been looking at the historical archives of uh, coercive institutions during Stalin's years and also during Mao's years, right?
Yeah.
And you might not know that, coercive institutions, the internal security agencies differ greatly between the two countries. And I wonder what you think about within case study, right?
Mm.
So you show kind of the evolution of institutions within early Mao and late Mao years. But once you give uh, institutions, even within autocracies, once you give your institutions a certain degree of power, it's actually not that easy to take it back, to rein
Mm.
back the power, right? So, so how does kind of institutional strength, if you like, kind of differ between, within case and between time period? Because, you know, bureaucrats want to have power. Once they get it from the autocrats, it's difficult to give it back.
Yeah. So I mean, here it's helpful, I think, to distinguish between the institutions for decision making that the book is focused on and the broader political power enjoyed by a course of organizations. Um, uh, which your work has touched on. Sheena Chestnut Greitman's, Dan Mattingly have all written about this. So I find it is the case that when it comes to the institutions for the leader's decision making, even in cases in which those coercive organizations are politically powerful, the leader still retains a bit of power to shape how they're going to engage with those powerful coercive organizations. And it might be the case that their choice is to reconfigure institution in a way that accommodates the organization's interests. You could think about the decision-making structure in Hu Jintao's era, which we know was pretty siloed and inefficient from that perspective, as a type of bargaining concession to the military, right? So Hu Jintao might not have been politically powerful enough in order to integrate the civilian and military components together. It could have also been a political calculation that he didn't want there to be too much bridging between the military Xitong and the civilians or the party Xitong, precisely because doing so would empower the civilian agency to have more contact with the military. So that's one way of thinking about the question that you posed.
Okay, very good. So let's take some questions from the floor.
Please.
So I see, some of my political science colleagues here who are actually not working on China, which is great to see. And I welcome questions which has got nothing to do with China,
Okay.
but everything to do with
Happy to do either.
with bureaucracies. Okay, a question from Lilac, which is one of our colleagues, Lilac Giladi. Thanks for the interesting talk. My question is there any importance for the didactic interaction between the types of organizational structures involved? For instance, in your earlier example, the China example, the main analysis requires assessment of US policy, whereas the second asks China to understand the USSR. Each of these has a different organizational design. In other words, is there strategic interaction here?
Yes. So it's a terrific point. And just to give a little bit more background, depending on who the viewership is here. So the question, if I understand correctly, is essentially positing that, a lot of bargaining between states in foreign policy crises might not just reflect the decision-making institutions in one country, but also the country that you're dealing with, that you're bargaining with. So in the example of the 69 conflict, it's both the United States, or pardon me, both the PRC and the USSR. So the book doesn't find or doesn't make a claim that this dyadic component is central to understanding the roots of miscalculation. But there is a kind of follow-on to it that I've explored in some additional work with Don Kasler that suggests that it might, in the sense that bureaucratic structures could affect the clarity of signals that come out from a state, right? So it might be the case that certain bureaucratic structures don't just provide more complete or accurate information internal to, say, the PRC or the Soviet Union, but rather also change the signaling environment, the informational environment that the PRC would observe. So I mentioned Don Kasler at the University of Illinois. We had a piece that came out in International Security earlier this year, which was focused directly on the signaling component. And what we found in regard to the 1962 Sino-Indian War is that fragmented institutions inside of India didn't just kind of lead to miscalculations inside the Indian system, but what it also did was send out contradictory and often confusing messages from India to China, which even in the fall of 1962 made it quite difficult for the PRC to understand precisely what it was that India was saying. So again, it wasn't in the cases that are looked at in the book, it doesn't make the case that this dyadic interaction was critical to the miscalculations that it studies. But I think the intuition is spot on, and some complementary research is trying to unpack that. So thank you. Great.
So if I could ask a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So if signaling by a foreign power or foreign adversary is important to the conflict outcome, would the leader in your argument, would the leader be in a better position or the bureaucracy be in a better position to take the signal into account?
Ye-
Because there has to be some sort of interaction for it to yield some, the more optimal conflict outcome, right?
So I think basically the way to think about it is, so let's say you have an efficient system in the receiving state of a signal, right? Um, their assessment task is made more difficult when the signaling environment is noisier. That's the kind of intuition here if we're shifting over to signaling. You kind of have there's three levels here. There's the baseline that it's just hard to get signals right. On top of that, you have to, within the receiving state, have an assessment process that's relatively good. That's what this book is about. And on top of that, even a good system you can make their lives harder if the signaling environment is really noisy. And that has to do with the transmitting or sending side. So that's a way of thinking about it.
So would the elite be in a better position or bureaucracies if there's kind of noisy signaling around?
Would they be, I'm not sure. How do you mean?
No, I'm just curious, if
Would,
there's a lot of signaling and you have to make important decisions that
yeah.
would determine conflict outcome, and you have bureaucracies saying that, this is what the foreign adversary wants to tell us, but the elite have a different intuition. Would the elite have better intuition than would the,
Oh, that's
yeah.
interesting. I don't know. I mean, I suppose it would depend upon within a noisy signal environment. Political leaders tend to, if the kind of most authoritative signals are coming from the leader level, let's say like in the context of the 62 case, that would be Nehru and Mao, Zhou and Mao, really. So yeah, perhaps the elite had a better insight because they can sort of put themselves in the shoes, perspective take, if you will, with their fellow politicians relative to the bureaucrats. But perhaps not too. I mean, so much of signaling happens below the leader level. Face-to-face summits are rare in the large scheme of things. Most kind of communication happens either at the minister level or below, as was the case in actually the lead up to the 62 war. Um, but it's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I have the perfect answer to it.
Sure, we have one other question.
Please.
If bureaucratic design is decisive in shaping conflict behavior, what prevents states from adopting more strategically optimal forms of organization?
Yeah.
And how can institutional inertia of political constraints be addressed? And this is by Lisa He, one of my students.
Yeah, it's not the focus of the talk, but it's definitely in the book. And so essentially what I argue is that domestic politics gets in the way of efficient foreign policy decision-making institutions. So these integrated institutions, they might be good from the perspective of decision-making. The trick from the perspective of a political leader is that when you integrate the design, it allows bureaucrats to have access to information. It allows them to build expertise. I mean, like imagine an extremely fragmented system in which there are no foreign ministers or defense ministers, right? There's just the existence of them as political actors in themselves opens up the risk that they're going to defect. And so from that perspective, the integrated design affords them more power if information is power in elite politics. And in situations in which political leaders feel that the bureaucratic state is a threat to their political survival or agenda, that integrated design, while it might be good from the perspective of decision making, doesn't look very good politically. So from that perspective, the political leader, when they feel that the state is a threat to their political interests, adopt a fragmented system for quite logical reasons, knowing that it's going to shield them politically, even if it leads them into foreign policy fiascos. So that's the kind of argument there.
Very
Great
good.
question.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for. So
Okay.
this is a webinar of Tyler Jost book Bureaucracies at War, and this book has won a number of awards from APSA and ISA. So I would urge you to go take a look. This is a virtual event, so we won't have books on sale, but it sounds really interesting and really relevant to understanding today's world. I hope you'll check it out, and thank you very much for joining us, and thanks, Tyler, for your time.
Thank you again for having me. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.